Okay, welcome back to math class and welcome to 9-3 transformations of quadratic functions. So far we've learned how to graph quadratic functions based on making a table, based on knowing its parts. Today we're going to talk about the different things that affect how we graph quadratic functions. Now the base function of a quadratic, like the root of a quadratic function, is this x squared. That's what sets it apart and makes it different from a linear equation. If you remember, linear equations look like this: y equals mx plus b. The highest exponent, the highest power that one of theirs went to was 1. So what sets a quadratic function apart is that it has that x squared. It can have other things added to it, but the x squared is what makes it a quadratic function. What we're talking about today is how adding different things to that x squared changes where the graph is going to be. So if we had just y equals f squared, y equals x squared, when I graph that, it's going to look something like this, right? My vertex at 0, coming up on both sides, pretty easy. If I add a number to this term, that's going to be how many spaces this moves up and down on the y-axis. So if I did x squared plus 2, x squared plus 2 is going to be 2 spaces up, and that's where I'm going to put my vertex. If I did y equals x squared minus 2, then I would draw my graph, and my vertex is going to be 2 spaces down. Hopefully that's making sense so far. So a number added to x squared, added to this term, is going to tell us how much up and down to move our parabola. How we're moving it on the y-axis. If I add a number to x in this term before it's squared, so instead of adding it on the outside, if instead it looked like this, x plus 2 squared. So this is if I'm adding something just to this term, adding a second term, but within this, I'm adding the 2. Then it's going to tell us how far we're moving it on our x-axis. So an x plus 2 squared is going to look more like 2 spaces on our x-axis over, coming up like this. Same if I had y equals x minus 2 squared. That's going to give us minus 2 on the x-axis before I draw it. Okay, just to recap quickly, adding it on the outside, adding a number on the outside moves it up and down vertically on our y-axis. Adding a number before I square it, plus or minus, is going to tell me positive, move it this way, negative, move it this way, horizontally side to side along our x-axis. Now some graphs are going to ask you to do both, and they're going to look something like, well, so what if I had x squared, well, both. I had x plus 2 squared plus 2 y equals. That means when I graph this, I'm going to move it right 2, but I'm also going to move it up 2 before I start it. And that's where I start my graph. So some of them will move up and down, some of them will move side to side, some of them will be both. That's all we're going to do for today on your homework for part 1 of transformations of quadratic functions.